Yeah, okay, got it. I could choose the option leave meeting. Yeah, I go now. It's fine. Hi, everyone. So for persons who don't know me yet, I'm Nathalie. I'm one of the senior academic and digital advisors here at University of Glasgow. And today I would like to talk a little bit about two methodologies you can use for your educational inquiries, for your SOTL projects. And the one is ethnography and the other one is case study. Now, with both of them, there is a really fun thing. You can actually also run an ethnographic case study combining both of these methodologies. So, but we get to this later. So the way I usually run these sessions is I'll talk a little about, please interrupt me, put your mic on, write something in the chat, ask questions, talk to me. You know, I don't really like talking at people too much. Well, I can obviously run for another 2 hours without taking breath, but that's a different skill set. Anyway, so before we look into ethnography, I just wanted to put up a little reminder that what we talked today about are methodologies or approaches to your education inquiries, to your SOTL projects. And in my opinion, methodology is the most important part of a SOTL project. It works a little bit like a TARDIS, you know, like a time machine, because what comes together in the methodology is you look backwards. So what you have learned from the literature, from your own experience, you are in the presence where you're having, okay, so what are the acute questions right now? What are the things I want to look at the moment? And you project into the future, like, how am I going to go about that? And so the methodology brings all of this together, and it's really important and unfortunately very often neglected aspect of writing for your educational inquiries. And in this way, presentation, I've given you a couple of guiding questions for your methodology you may want to refer to at a later point. So there's not much point in talking through them. So, but one of the things I want to basically have a little warm-up exercise with everyone to talk about ethnography. Sarah, when you click on this little card stack at the below left, then you can enlarge it. Exactly. So what I would like to do now is, can everyone in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and just tell me, right, when you think about the color blue, what comes to mind? Everything that you can think of. And I give you 30 seconds. Now I don't have timer. In 30 seconds, write down everything you can think of for the color blue. Go. What pops into your mind when we say blue? And you can use the chat to write it in the chat, and then open the chat and keep an eye on it. So what do you think of when you hear color blue? What is it that pops into your mind? Yeah, sea, sky, jeans, navy, Scotland, Smurf, ice cream, Neapels, blue bubblegum, paintings, bathroom, seaside, blue jays, lapis lazuli, nice, denim, fabulous. So that's brilliant. Thank you, everyone. So what you've noticed is, we can go to the next card, Sarah, if you, what you notice is that the answers everyone has given, you can see there are some overlaps. You know, very often we get sky, we get the sea, we get usually water-related things. And one of the aspects of ethnography is to estrange the familiar, to question the things we make assumptions about. So when we teach about, for instance, imagine you need to teach the color blue in your classroom. And we all have different associations, but there are some commonalities we just assume everyone has. But when we think about the color blue, not everyone is able to experience blue in the same way due to different visual ability. So some people may experience it very differently, or some people might not be able to experience the color blue at all. So, so when you think about your learners and when you think about questioning your learning environment, when you present things that seem to be so maybe obvious, or we are just making these inert assumptions about, like the color blue, then ethnography asks you to actually look into these assumptions. So not just to think about, it's not just about reflecting on your assumptions, but also becoming aware of assumptions we are making. And another aspect that ethnography is looking into is culture. So, and we know that language is culturally determined. And so, for instance, a really nice example for blue is feeling blue in English can mean you feel under the weather. Do you notice what I do there? I just make the assumptions that when I say under the weather, what that means. Now, if we have international students, for instance, or students that are bilingual in English, they may not necessarily be aware of all the idioms we are using. So, so when we can use metaphors and we talk about them, but it might also be useful to explain them a little bit. So feeling blue, feeling under the weather, meaning maybe you have low energy, you're tired, you're feeling a bit sad. And then there are things that become even a bit more complicated, because feeling blue or blueing blue in English means you're feeling a little bit low on energy. In German, it means you had too much to drink. So, and what we do with ethnography is we are trying to estrange the familiar. That means all these things we use all the time, and we are making assumptions about how everyone else experiences them or knows about them. We question that, and we untangle all these assumptions and these perspectives. Sarah, do you want to get out of the cards again, or go to the next one? Yeah, get out of the card. So there's this little cross on the top. Yeah, and so the aim of ethnography, so one of the aims of ethnography is basically to challenge these assumptions. It is a study of culture that can utilize different methods, different forms of data. And and it acknowledges the researcher as the instrument. And this is what that little exercise with the blue was about. Is yes, we had a lot of overlap, like genes, like the sea, like the sky, but everyone also has very personal, idiosyncratic experiences, and all of our selves, our history, our experiences, our background influences how we think about things, how we see things. And this is what becomes quite important in ethnography to consider, because that influences how we ask questions, how we interpret, how we describe things. Does this make sense so far? I can't see anyone, so if you're not, I can't see it. If someone can shout or text. Do you have any questions?
You're getting thumbs up from Alison and Mona.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't see any of this right now. Okay, super. Thank you very much. So what is ethnography then? So some of the definitions of ethnography include things like it researches everyday realities. So this means it's a really good methodology to use in your classroom, because this is something you are engaged with on a regular basis, on a daily basis, or not just with your classroom, with any of the work you're doing that you're continuously, regularly involved in. It is an ethnographer is an observer of people and events as they unfold. So usually an ethnography means you need to spend a significant amount of time. Now, this is one of the aspects that is quite tricky, because there's lots of debate of what actually is a significant amount of time. And this is maybe a discussion for another point, because that could potentially be a session just on itself. It is a systematic inquiry that builds on different perspectives. And And the researcher's bias here is made transparent throughout the data collection and the interpretation process. So for instance, to my PhD, my supervisor asked me to write a small autobiography to make myself aware of these biases, you know, similar to what we've done with the color blue, to write down of how do I think about things, you know, how do I think about the things I'm going to explore? What is my perspective? What may have influenced my perspective? And so one example I like to use, because I think for me that was one of the biggest kind of aha moments during research, was, so I grew up on a farm, you know, I grew up and it was all kind of mud, trees, climbing on things and playing with the animals. And I've undertaken research in an area where the students were living in high-rise towers. And I've used some visual research methods, which we can talk about as well, and asked the students to take pictures of their environment. And one student had given me a photo, and it was a gray November day in Glasgow, right? It was a gray sky, the sun barely breaks through, and there's this gray high-rise tower and a gray cement on the ground. And to me, it just looked horrible, you know, and that was coming from my bias of having grown up just in nature, basically. So now, acknowledging that bias means I'm acknowledging I'm being careful in how I ask questions. So I'm not influencing when I talk to my participants about their experience and their images they've submitted. So I ask the participants simply if they could tell me about that photo, you know, what encouraged them to take it and what does it mean for them. And the participant told me, oh, it's beautiful because that high rise connects the earth with the sky. And I was really, I've never even considered that this is a possibility of seeing this, you know. And so, but being aware of your biases also means you can monitor yourself and you can monitor your language and make sure you're not influencing when you're having conversations, and bringing your bias into the conversations, but try to keep your language neutral. You never can be entirely unbiased. You never can be entirely objective. It's not possible because it's not how our brains work, but you can make yourself aware of certain mechanisms and behaviors and thinking. An aspect that comes through ethnography is a thick description, which I really, really like. And that means you usually begin with describing the situations and before you interpret them. And I actually have a little exercise if you are up for it. And maybe Sarah, maybe we can stop sharing the screen for a moment. I don't know. Thank you. So maybe a little exercise we could do is try describe the current learning situation. So I'll give you a couple of minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so, to become an ethnographer at the moment and try to describe the first 20 minutes of the session. And I give you 5 minutes. You can just take some bullet points. Have a think about it, you know, how would you go about it? So you can use pen and paper, you can type, you can write it in a chat if you want, you can just write it on your own, but whatever you feel like. I'll give you 5 minutes in trying to describe the current teaching situation, and then maybe check in with you what you've noticed. I feel I should play some music in the background now. But I've been spending all morning dancing to Joe and Jet, so that's not probably the right writing music. Now that I closed the window, they stopped mowing the lawn. Thank you, Alison, for sharing. So I'd say maybe finish up your first writing. What do you think were the main thing you noticed in your description? I see, Alison, you wrote down online Zoom meeting was the first the first context. So yeah.
I suppose it's very descriptive rather than reflective. It's not, well, I've put some things in about like communication styles and stuff, but generally it's quite descriptive.
Yeah, but that's what the first thing is. Sarah wrote all about disruptions. So the first aspect is actually trying to be as descriptive as possible and then interpret later, because it's, I don't know, do you know, I don't know if some of you read Terry Pratchett, and in one of the books he wrote about, I thought it was always so funny because it really reflects for me ethnography. He was writing about witches having the first sight and the second sight, and the first sight is the interpretation, and the second sight is looking at what's actually there. So, and I've always thought that was quite an interesting analogy for ethnography, where you're initially like, oh, this is all the stuff that's happening, and then you go, oh, wait a moment, what was it that's actually there, and what is it I can actually notice or hear or smell or see? And the description of a classroom, for instance, is really important, because the space, and there's research about it, the space, how people sit, how they, has an influence on a situation. So yeah, Jen, you got your camera on. Did you want to say? Do you want to join?
Yeah, so I started by writing about what I observed about the first 5 minutes of the meeting and like the technical difficulties, but also I described what I felt you were expressing about annoyance about the university providing laptops, because well, not in a bad way, but because for me it framed then how I was interpreting how you were facilitating, or at least how you were expressing yourself. So I started like I started there. I didn't even come to the Zoom meeting aspect of it until a bit later.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that is and that's perfect. Thank you. So this is so important, because it influences how someone thinks about a situation or how they approach a situation. As you just said, I'm feeling quite stressed because I don't have my two screens, I don't have the laptop working. I'm extremely worried because I have 26 assignments to mark and my laptop is dead. So, and I'm currently in the back of my head also freaking out a little bit of how am I going to fix this today, you know? And yes, and this, sorry, Jen, do you want to say, and this impact?
I was going to say I felt an immediate affinity with you. Well, no, because of the problem of maybe our perceptions of the extent to which the university provides us with those resources, but also how we feel when we do things online. And I recognized that the rest of the session, I would think about that relationship differently, no matter kind of what you did afterwards, because I felt I had an understanding of how it feels to start something in that state of chaos.
And it's really, this is fantastic. And this is already interpretation, you know, that awareness of I'm feeling this immediate affinity because being there, done this, I know how stressful that feels, you know, and that changes exactly. And this changes the perspective of how we see something, you know, and how we interpret something. And we might be more generous with an interpretation when we feel this affinity, while if we don't feel that affinity or trust, or if someone doesn't come across as authentic, we may not be as generous in our interpretations. And this is something that is really important to notice, because ethnography is depending so much on a researcher as an instrument, and also on the participants and the interactions with the participants, and also building trust. So for instance, I had one of the students in my long-term study, and she did not want to participate until I was in the field for a year. And after a year, she approached me, and then she said to me, okay, I understand now what you do, I want to participate. You know, so, and it took a year to build that trust with that one participant. And so I think one of the things that's also really important in ethnography is that it is quite relational if you're in it. And if you're interested, just for information, because it's not really SOTL related, but it's very ethnography related, there is this video, and there was a well-known ethnographer who undertook research with the Hells Angels in the 70s maybe. And this ethnographer went native, what we call going native. And that means they lost that perspective. You know, they lost that outside perspective, that ability to take a step back within yourself and look at a situation. And that is something that can happen, you know, particularly if you spend a lot of time in the field. And the other thing is, when you think about it, in SOTL, we explore our own practice predominantly. You know, the first thing usually in SOTL is we're exploring our own practice. So we basically are native, and we need to unnative ourselves. You know, we need to start questioning and going, well, actually, why am I doing this? Or why is the room set up like this? And for instance, in a school I've undertaken my PhD, in Germany, you don't get pens or erasers or paper in school. And so I came to school and everyone was getting their erasers and their pens from the teacher and their papers. And maybe it was just idiosyncratic to that English as additional language unit. I was like, this is strange, but nobody questioned in that situation, questioned that the kids would get pens and papers and erasers, you know, and I was like, this is really strange. So even these little simple things can have a meaning, because they come from somewhere, you know. So there is a history, a development of how this happens or why we are doing things in a certain way. And so that can help unearth question. So it basically leads to the next aspect, is like, well, when are we actually using ethnography? And quite often we use ethnography, or predominantly when we are undertaking something exploratory. So if we want to poke at something, to understand something where we may not be able to theorize yet, we might observe something in our classroom, in our praxis, and discern a pattern or discern certain behaviors, but we can't quite figure out where they come from. So this is where ethnography might be able to help, because you're not yet theorizing, you're just wanting to try and figure out what's going on. Or if we already have some assumptions about it, but we want to approach that in terms of the participant voice. So one of the things I'm concerned about is, in in smaller projects or in projects where we don't have much time or don't have much resources, the research design can end up becoming a bit of a voiceover for the research participants instead of giving them a voice. So when we think about, just think about something like questionnaire design in Likert scales. When we give a Likert scale question, for instance, we already made an assumption about how something is. We just want to know on what scale that how something is, but we already made an assumption that that thing is a thing. Or if there are multiple choice questions, we already made an assumptions about answers. And if you've ever filled in any of the customer service questionnaires and you went, yeah, it kind of sort of, but not quite fits what I think. And in ethnography, and because you can be a methodological omnivore, you can literally use any types of research methods you feel like. You can use creative research methods, you can use blackout poetry, you can use collages, you can use Lego, you can use Play-Doh, you can just talk to people, you can have observations, you can ask your research participants to journal. So you can use methods that make sense for your participants, for how they need or can or want to express themselves. Think about back to that color blue. If you only ask people to express themselves in the color blue, and people who can't experience the color blue in a specific way, they won't be able to express themselves appropriately. So this is a way, and ethnography, I think, can offer that, because it doesn't have it doesn't have a strict set of methods that you need to apply. And this is similar for case studies. There's no very set, strict way of these are the only methods you can use or you should use. Yes, there are traditional methods which are typical for ethnography, like field observations, research diaries, conversations, interviews, things like this. But it is not restricted to that. Does this make sense so far? Good, cool. So I'm a bit conscious of time. So there is an exercise I have here. I think we can maybe, so what I would say that I have an exercise here. What I would say is we can maybe leave it to the end, and if there's a bit time at the end, we can finish the session off with that little exercise. So the other aspect I wanted to talk about today is sorry, I just had a brain freeze. Is a case study. So a case study is see, cognitive load. My computer is broken, so my brain is literally in the back of my head is constantly going. I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I going to fix this? So the case study is basically I'm always trying to find the best summary of it, and I have not yet figured it out. So it is basically looking at something that is restricted in time and size and space. So a case study can be in the least. So if you, for instance, work with, say, for instance, I work, so I'm sometimes work as a tutor for Dyslexia Scotland. So if I work with one specific student, then that could be a case. That one student could be a case over a time of 1 to 3 years. However, a case could also be one session. Say, for instance, you had this one session you were never quite happy with. And then you had an idea how to revamp it, how to rejiggle it, and you wanted to know how your students experience that one session. Then that one session could be a case with a cohort of students for a certain amount of time. However, a case study can also be you have redesigned a program or redesigned a course, and you want to look throughout the whole semester how your students engage with that course. So then that case is this student cohort throughout the semester, and that one session that in the other case study was your case becomes a unit of analysis. So that is something that can be sometimes a little bit tricky to discern in a case study, but it depends on what it is, again, what it is you actually want to look at and how you're framing it. So there is a really good, the Sage Dictionary of Social Research Methods is really good. And when you forgot, oh, what was this again? And you just want to look up something quickly, we have this available online. And Yup writes, basically, a case study is an approach that uses in-depth investigation of one or more examples of a current social phenomenon, utilizing a variety of sources and data. A case can be an individual person, an event, a social activity, group, organization, or institution. And again, the author alludes to rich data. And again, that leads to, is because you're not restricted to specific methods. You try to get as many data points as possible to look from different angles and explore, really what is going on. And so using different data collection methods can help you to get this rich data. But it's also, rich descriptions are important, as Jen and Alison said, and Sarah as well picked up on the disruption, it's like this. So what are all the things that are going on in this situation, from noises, from the interaction the students have with one another, from your own positionality, because you as an educator influence a situation, or in whatever situation you're undertaking yourself in, you're influencing that situation as well. And your mood can change. And I think everyone who has ever taught before knows that you run one session with one cohort and it's awesome, it flows, everyone is engaged. You run that same session at a different time and it completely flatlines. Yeah, exactly, Jen. It completely flatlines. And this is the thing. So why does it flatline? It went perfectly fine beforehand. Why in that one situation does it flatline? Or why did it only work once and every other time it didn't? And this is because, this is why I'm getting really excited, because learning and teaching is so complex and there's so many variables in it that influence it. I once taught English in kindergarten, and weather, I swear, weather was a big thing. And it was a gray, stormy day. I knew the kids would not have fun doing proper learning activities. So I would sit in the snuggle corner and they would literally all pile on top of me, and we would have an English book and then we would just read stories, because there was no way I could get them to do big children's tasks and drawings and vocabulary. You just, and you could tell. And it was simply, for the small kids, it was simply the weather, had such a massive impact on their mood. But it could be all kinds of things, having a session after lunchtime, and all these kind of things can have an impact, and really unearthing them can be really, really important. Case study as well, as Cohen writes, provides a chronological narrative relevant to the case. And this was the difference, for instance, how Alison and how Jen recorded. Jen, you started really chronologically, and you've noticed that in that one event, broken computer, what an impact that had, longer reaching, And Alison, you were focusing on, for instance, the environment, she had another Zoom meeting, and then what impact does this have on our interaction? If we would be in the classroom, it might be very, very different, and I might talk much less. So these are things that all can play a role. So I put in this way, I put a lot of kind of little descriptions and also reflections I wrote on myself, so you can refer back to them almost like a little handout you can make use of, and there's also references and literature to it in there. So another aspect in a case study is that real life context is key. And real life context, what I mean by this is basically, you may know about clinical case studies, where psychologists, for instance, work with a patient, or doctors work with a patient and they have a case study there. However, that still, when you think about it, technically is a real life context for the doctors, because that's what they do on a daily basis, And so in your classroom, it's the same. That is your real life context for your case, because that's what you do. That's your job. That's what you're working on. Versus what I mean by this is that in my undergraduate degree, it was very quantitative. So educational research was done quantitative. And so there wasn't really real life context, because all these tests we learned were set up in situations that were specifically designed to collect data. So it wasn't really how the real life teaching would happen, or the real life learning, you know, in just classroom interaction would happen. It was specifically designed just to collect data. So it wasn't necessarily something that would be realistic and as an experience for the learners, because it was simply designed to collect data. Does this make sense? I don't know if my explanation makes kind of sense, yeah. Rich data is important, and contextual data. So think about, you know, as we said, you know, what is the situation? What is the environment like? What is the day like? Do you have any questions right now? So what I would suggest we could do, if you would be up for it, Gabriela, do you want to say something? Because you switched your camera.
Yeah, just probably the usual question that I ask every time is, how do we do in terms of ethical approval when it comes to collect data that are related to ethnography?
Sorry, can you repeat this again?
Yeah, what is the ethical approval that we need for data for autoethnography?
So autoethnography is a bit of a different thing, and incidentally, Alison also asked for this, and Nick and I are running a session next week, Sarah, about reflexive practice in autoethnography. But ethnography or autoethnography, you need you know, like when you apply for ethics, is any, you know, it's your normal process how you apply for ethics. You consider who are the researchers, who are the people who are undertaking the education inquiry, who are your participants, what are you asking your participants to do in terms of data collection, what is it you as an ethnographer do for data collection. So for instance, if I'm writing a research diary to take notes on a daily basis, maybe after each teaching session, then this is one of the research methods, is my research diary. If I am asking people to take photos, participants to take photos, or to draw images, or to make comics, or then each of these aspects I'm using to collect data, and I'm planning to interpret or interview them about. All of these are then data collection tools, so they are methods. Does this make sense? So they have to go into the ethics application to say, you know, I'm going to ask my students to I've done this with master students before. I'm going to ask my students to create their master's project as a Play-Doh model, you know, and then I talk to them about that. So your research method would be basically in the creation of the Play-Doh model plus the interview or the focus groups or conversations you have with them about that, and you write this down as methods. Does this answer the question? I'm not entirely sure what you mean.
No, it does. But my main thoughts is, let's say that I do normal teaching and I observe something really good, and I want to think about what did I do to actually promote that particular outcome. I didn't know do any ethical approval before, but if I focus mainly on myself and what I did, would that be something I can anyway write about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and this is something we are going to discuss in more detail in the next session that Sarah just shared. There's a difference between autoethnography and reflective practice or reflexive practice. So reflective practice or reflexive practice, I don't need ethics, you don't need ethics approval, because you're not collecting any data. You are thinking, you're reflecting, you're thinking about what you've done in the classroom, and you are relating it to literature and to try to identify, this is something I've done, these are the reasons why I've done this. This is how I perceive that I've worked. However, in the moment you collect data, and here this is maybe the distinction, in autoethnography, this reflection becomes data. So you're not just sharing your reflection, you're using this reflection and then you're analyzing it. So you're thinking about, okay, so what are the different themes that are emerging in my reflection? You know, what are the different codes, the different categories? So what are the different aspects I'm thinking about? And so maybe one aspect is technology, maybe another aspect is stress, maybe another aspect is the joy in doing something hands-on. And so you are using your reflections as data. And at that point, you need ethics approval because you're using data. Same when you ask your students for feedback. If you use anything your students have said to you or done, then you need ethics approval for it because you are collecting data, you're collecting something from your students. There may be situations, now there is a distinction between the need for ethics approval and the need for consent from your students. So the students have, but this is something you need to talk to your ethics committee about. So when the students sign on, they sign a data sharing agreement. So there are specific aspects of data you may be able to use without asking for consent from the students because they already consented to it, but you still need ethics. You still need to tell the ethics committee why you want to use, for instance, I don't know what type of data that would be. So check this with your ethics committee, but it might be, you know, grade point averages or something without student names, without any associations or something. But you still need ethics for this because the ethics committee still needs to understand that you're making an ethical use of the data and that the use of the data has a valid and positive purpose. Does this make sense, or did I confuse you more? Sorry, it gets really complex at some point, and I would always suggest, if you are in doubt, talk to your ethics committee about it and ask them these questions. Yeah. Oh, it's okay. So Alison said you would like some papers that show the difference between the two. We can definitely look up some papers on autoethnography versus reflexive practice. I think that's a good way to inform yourself. Yeah. Yeah, are there any other questions or comments? Oh, okay. So next week when I'm running a session together with Nick Keeper, we are talking about reflexive practice versus autoethnography in a bit more detail. But I think the biggest distinction maybe to make between ethnography and autoethnography is that in ethnography, the researcher is the person who undertakes the ethnography is the instrument. In autoethnography, the researcher basically, or actually the actions, behaviors become data, it's like you're basically a research participant in your own research, and you're exploring social phenomenon, you're exploring certain topics and ideas through your own perspective, and you are linking it with the wider context. And this is the distinction maybe between ethnography and autoethnography. It's probably more complex and more detailed, but yeah, I think maybe for the purpose of now, it's yeah. So if you're up for it in the last 5 minutes or so, on this way that Sarah shared, I should have done this in Pages to make that easier. I added 2 images, a little audio track and a little film track, and you can do this right now if you want to. So these are media files, and I intentionally so there is a little bit of alt text for each, but not a very in-depth one, because engage with the one that is the easiest accessible for you and that talks to you. And basically go a little bit further from our first exercise, and basically, can you describe what you hear, see, or otherwise perceive? Then what do you think is going on there? And then reflect, would everyone else see it the same way, or are there different ways of experiencing that medium you choose to engage with? It's under the heading, when to use ethnography. And if you scroll down past the Going Native video, and there's the blue text with the instructions, and then you have 2 images, an audio file and a little video file. So I don't know, Sarah, is there enough time to do this now, or should we maybe just give this as, if you want to give this as homework? Gabriella already had to leave. Yeah,
I think we should probably give it as homework, because it's
it's too short amount of time. So if you want to do this, basically the idea behind this little exercise is that description can be quite challenging to undertake. It's when you start learning writing, sometimes people are asked, describe how you make a piece of toast, and then think about really, how do you explain to someone how to make a piece of toast? And this is really, when you start describing something, to get this rich description, is really thinking about what you experience in a situation with all the senses you can use, and then start to think about an interpretation of this, because what we experience and how we experience this can be quite different. And so this is kind of the point of the exercise a little bit, and then to take that step back once you've thought about what you think is going on there, and take that step back and then think, okay, would everyone else understand it the same way I do, or are there different perspectives of understanding that image, that audio track, that situation than I do? And that is basically kind of like one of those basic exercises you can do for an ethnographic approach to something. Yeah, so I stop waffling now. You know where to find me if you have any questions. I hope that little run through gave you at least a rough overview of the principles. There is more information in this way, but it was more important for me that you have a little bit of praxis and a little bit of thinking of how that actually would look like in real life. And